Well, welcome everyone. My name is Xochitl Hernandez. I am an organizing fellow at the Horizons Project, and I am pleased to welcome you here to our fourth Intermestic webinar, part of our Intermestic Learning Exchanges series, which we organize in collaboration with the Democracy Resource Hub. Be sure to check the Democracy Resource Hub, where we put up not only the recordings of these webinars, but also insights, summaries, and also additional resources that we hope can help continue the conversation and also help get you to continue those conversations wherever you are and whoever you're with. It is an honor for me to welcome you all to this, which is our last webinar. And let me begin, in case you're new, and this is your first webinar, I would like to share just a little bit of the idea behind it. The word intermestic is the word that we're using at Horizons Project and also using it by other organizations to bridge the spaces of international pro-democracy work and advancing human rights and social justice with that of the domestic internal work that a lot of civil society are doing within the United States, at the state level, at the community level, at the national level. So this is a token word. Think of it as cross-border, think of it as international. But this is also to help us bridge between these two fields, which can be isolated and which we want to benefit from that cross-pollination and also that building of solidarity that is so needed right now with the global pro-democracy movement, especially with our colleagues in the US. So that's just for an introduction. And also that brings us to today's webinar, which is, I think, a much needed webinar. We've heard from many of our partners and also our friends and also colleagues about how important it is to come together to discuss also the issue of resilience. The elephant in the room, the US election just finished. Wherever you may be in the spectrum of reactions to the election's results, the main element is that elections for any pro-democracy movement, movements that are advancing human rights, that are advancing civil rights all across the world, elections are pivotal moments. Whether you're working at the community level, whether you're working at the national level, the high level of energy that concentrates around these times is something that we cannot assume just can pass away. Many people are just digesting, processing, and also thinking ahead. And it is inevitable for all of us to think about how this moment and pivotal moments can affect movements, organizations that are the front line of defending democracy. And what does that mean also with whatever election results may come and their future implications? So that is the conversation that we're bringing today. We have an amazing group of organizers, all of them, I would say, who come from different spaces in the US and also that have worked in different countries and that we hope can weave the conversation. This is not meant to be a lecture. This is meant to be kind of like an insight point into a conversation started. And also our panelists will be invited to respond to each other because that is in the exchange of ideas that learning actually happens. Thinking that we know most people might be joining from different parts of the world, I would like to invite people to share where they are tuning in from. There should be a poll coming in front of you so you can fill in the poll just for us to get a sense of where you're calling from, and just get to see where are the follow-up conversations will be happening. Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. All right. So, to start, in recognizing how important it is that we not only think of this conversation, I will share the results so everyone also gets to see that. It's so nice to see also that people are joining from different parts of the world, but we are also thinking about our colleagues in the United States. So in the spirit also of building global solidarity, it's important to know where we are located and what our positionalities might be. And thinking about that, the topic of resilience, and we're using also the word post-electoral management because of, the amount of energy that comes from these moments in history. We are also thinking not only of movements, but also individuals in that movements, people. Even though I'm not going to use the word individual because I know there are conversations about individualism, but also like people, the person. And these are things that we also hope to be discussing today. I would like to invite our first panelist, conversational partner, I will call Eva Mawarire, who is a prominent activist from Zimbabwe, the founder of this flag movement, and also a fellow at the Renew Democracy Initiative. Evan, I would like to give you the first space to share and bring us back to, like the experience, the first-hand experience that you had navigating very similar moments and also, embodying that search for resilience that we're all trying to navigate to. So passing it on to you.
Awesome. So Jill, thank you so much for having me, and really cool to kind of get a chance to, I guess, learn with everybody, reflect upon what's happened in the US, but also reflect upon our own journeys in terms of where we're coming from in this kind of this growth in resilience, because you grow. It's a journey. You grow in, in being resilient. So I'm from Zimbabwe, as you said, and my journey with particularly, political and democracy activism actually begins in 2016, which is quite recent. But it begins there in terms of me being involved intentionally and doing it on a full-time basis, and really giving it my all. But it had begun much earlier. Zimbabwe has been on this journey of, the search for freedom and the fight for democracy and human rights for, for many years, close to kind of 45 years. So, this idea of waking up to either an election result or a nation after a violent or a tough election is something that we've lived with, for many years. I was laughing with some friends the other day, and I was like, I feel like, we Zimbabweans have this experience of waking up to, an election result that hasn't gone their way, even though everyone kind of thought this is definitely the way it was going to go. And we just, you just kind of gird up your loins and you figure it out, and you're like, okay, we gotta keep doing life. So my journey begins in 2016, started a citizens movement by complete accident, wasn't intending on doing it. And it became a huge citizens movement. Over 3 years, we led some huge protests that were able to non-violently shut the country down, ended up in a maximum security prison, arrested 8 times and tortured and charged with treason. But we carried on doing the work. And I guess one of the biggest lessons that we learned was, and I'm still learning even now, we were having a conversation with Ashley earlier on, the biggest lesson that we learned, and I'm still learning, is that this this whole journey of the fight for freedom or democracy or equality or justice it's not an event, it's a process, right? And you're part of a process, you're part of a journey. And I think that's part of what finally has begun to help some of us in Zimbabwe. We still struggle, again, by the way, with the fact that things have not gone our way in a particular season. But it's a season that is set in a very long time frame. And so I think that's been one of the understandings, is that we each are participating in a time frame that's part of a process. And the goal is for us to be able to leave the stage or leave the movement or the fight for democracy in a place where the next wave of freedom seekers and those that are fighting for a better nation or justice can have a more solid platform to go from, despite what the election result, is. And it's hard divorcing the election result from the kind of state of the fight for freedom when that election result hasn't gone your way. Is difficult. But I think that's one of the things that we have to learn to do, is to kind of uncouple those two, that there is an election and an election result, but we have a process, we have a mission, we have a purpose, we have a journey that transcends the election results or the election processes that we've had now and the ones that we shall have in the future. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Evan. And it's an important element to think also about the different elements of the terms. We're thinking immediate term, medium term, longer term, like those categories that may come in different spaces, but like the sense of process being central to it. I would like to now invite Isabella Cuomo with us. Isabella is the trainer and head researcher at the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies. And I'm excited to come with her because also this center, Canvas for short, recently also completed some research thinking about that resilience, elements about sustainability, but also care and protection for activists that are working for democracy around the world. But Isabella, besides talking about the research, you also have been working with activists all around the world and have seen, the ups and downs of what that process that Evan is mentioning can be. So I also would like to invite you to share a little bit of that and also like the lessons that those experiences can offer us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Hoshlet. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for having me today and having Canvas. It's a really important conversation and we're excited to be a part of it. So, Canvas is headquartered out of Belgrade, Serbia, and it was born out of a student-led movement called Otpor, which mobilized its own general population across multiple countries and overthrew Slobodan Milosevic. So over those, 20 years since the revolution, been educating activists all over the world in how to lead good campaigns to achieve victory. But I love what Evan said because it really underpins the reason we undertook more research and created a new training curriculum. Activists have been asking for ways to help maintain their well-being and their campaign for the long run. Because just because you achieve victory at one stage doesn't mean your fight is over. Just in the same way, if you lose an election, it doesn't mean your fight is over, right? We have to keep going for another day. But this is much easier said than done. So Canvas came together and we did a massive research project looking at literature and research and tools that the nonviolent community has developed all over the world, as well as, speaking with over 50 subject matter experts and activists to ask them, what do you need? What are the challenges that you have faced? And we also launched a mental health and well-being survey all around the world. And I'm really proud to say that we got some high level of response on that. So some of the key findings we found, right? Activists are facing similar risks all over the world. A key one, cyberbullying and trolling. And of course, that has physical, digital, and mental health impacts. Burnout and trauma is another one, right? In our survey, we found 55% of, participants have experienced physical abuse at some point in their lifetime. And even more concerning, 25% of respondents who identify as activists have attempted suicide. So we're talking about a crisis here to our ability to keep fighting, right? And some other things we've heard that, Evan has already touched on, being able to protect ourselves when we're undertaking direct actions, whether that be a street protest or standing guard or confronting law enforcement directly, as well as physical surveillance and attacks potentially by, opponent groups that don't agree with our kind of campaign. So, further to that research, the reason that we put together a curriculum is that we found that there are activists around the world that are creating some strategies or efforts to protect themselves, but it's tending to come about after repression has already happened. You've been attacked, you've been arrested, someone's been kidnapped, and that's why you're going to put some protection measures in place. But even then, we're finding that those efforts are a bit fragmented, right? Activists are having a hard time creating something that can protect them before repression and ensure that they can keep going when it will inevitably occur. And with that said, we put together this curriculum. It helps an activist, whether they're an individual or a whole movement, to create those strategies. And for elections, it's really seen as that kind of major window of opportunity, right, for any campaign. But the challenge, I think, especially after the US election and what Canvas is tracking on, we're seeing some indicators that are concerning around a potential Democratic backsliding, right? We've already seen that happening in some areas of the US, and we're concerned about what that will mean around the safety to activists moving forward here. So we've seen trends elsewhere around the world around physical and digital surveillance, increases in repression and on freedom of speech. And we're concerned about that occurring here in the US at a greater degree. So, what I'd like to offer today is kind of a call to all of those amazing change makers around the US that have been fighting already for so long. We want to make sure that you're able to continue your fight. We want to be a part of that. And that resilience element is really critical, right? And what that will come down to is taking a pause, creating some structure, and creating a strategy on how you can protect yourself before the repression occurs, and to create a backup plan so that when it does happen, you can turn around and you can keep on fighting. So thank you again for having us. Really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That brings us home in so many ways, especially thinking about building a structure and thinking about the important also perspectives that Evan also brought in terms of that process element. I'd like to also now invite Ashley Johnson. Ashley is the training innovation manager at Race Forward. And Ashley, I think you've also been seeing, and probably embodying a lot of this conversation. Like since they zero after all the election in the US, thinking about, what Evan and Isabella have already contributed. You see this structure, and I know you've also as a trainer see, like that structure in terms of like what movements can do and also what the person within the movement can do. So I'd like to invite you to share, I would say the breadth of experience that you have, but also like the insight that you have of this particular moment too, with all the different people you've been working with.
Thank you so much. And, I'm like brimming. My brain is percolating in lots of different ways. I come to this work as a facilitator, as a non-traditional educator by trade. And because I want to, in this moment, lift up the importance of non-traditional educators because our education systems are dealing with are becoming the forefront, the foreground of this, of like the attacks on racial justice in this country. And we are going to need a lot of people who are traditional educators and non-traditional educators, people who may not think of themselves as the folks who are teaching and encouraging and creating environments for learning. We're going to need those folks and encourage and empowering them. But I come to this work from the lens of racial justice. And I wasn't just doing racial justice training before this. I was engaged in like lots of criminal legal systems and thinking about what and how we deal with violence in communities alternative to like incarceration, which has destructive impacts on our world, our like our physical environments, and then also in I appreciate Isabella bringing out really disturbing data about the psychological impacts of movement work on folks, because those are the things that we see in learning environments. I don't know about y'all, but none of these things are fertile ground to learn. This idea of people needing to pause and strategize is critical for learning. We've seen surges in the past, like surges and ebbs and flows in the past couple of years since the uprising of George Floyd in this country, of people really wanting to engage in learning spaces and practice together. And learning is a journey and a process and needs a particular container for unpacking and getting to some of this like root cause systems analysis that allows us to apply the learning to our worlds, our spaces in a way that is not just, I don't want to say individualistic as a placeholder, but in a way that is not self-destructive, because it's very easy to try to hold the breath of history in our bodies, and those things can be degenerative unto themselves. We are moments of history. Our lives are moments in these histories, and it's not meant for us to just take it all on and try to figure out how we individually can move a needle of human experience. But that said, I think that training is a really effective tool for strengthening resilience in social movements. And I have lots of, from the lens of strategy, I've been really thinking about and encouraging like other folks who are facilitators, educators, practitioners to rethink, repackage, recreate this idea of how we think about training as not one-stop shop, like moving out of the capitalistic framing of training. It's like, how are we creating these long learning arcs, and how are we thinking about these things as exchanges and seeing ourselves as part of a broader continuum of a movement? Because maybe in my timeline, me as a trainer and a facilitator, my job is just to give people tools. And then what does that mean for the next person in the marathon as they're passing the baton, right? And how do I think about the learning arc in that? And how are we creating these collaborative learning arcs is something that I'm really invested in. And I'm happy to talk with y'all about, because I think that that's part of the resilience. And it also can tend to some of these like larger care strategies too, because we're trying to do too much, too fast, too much. And that's what's happening in the learning spaces. People are trying to learn too much and being really disheartened by that.
Thank you so much for that, Ashley. Because also like that brings us back to the recognition of that sense of process. I think I'm gonna go counterclockwise now and begin maybe with you, because I think like that element of the centrality of training. I'm gonna go rogue here and just think also like as a process. We always think of learning as a process. So that it's a useful framework. And I think also the context can be a powerful learning moment, especially after moments like elections, like big historical events that kind of create that enormous pressure, demand, energy, that can create exhaustion, that can create, I've seen also people even using the word depression, especially after, like the fear that the uncertainty of, you know, the historical moments may mean for their rights, may mean for their movements, may mean for their organization. So thinking about what can the moment teach us from that learning and training perspective might be useful. Let me now ask you also in terms of like, what do you think could be those elements that we can learn also from these moments? And also thinking about that fast and also like that sense of urgency that many people have. I think we heard from Isabella saying this is we need to take a pause and prepare. So what would you do in that pause, and what would you share with those that you're working with to start thinking about that can help us take advantage of that pause for this moment especially?
I can hop in.
Go ahead.
It's an interesting question. I have a reflection I'd love to share with you all. And I just noticed in the location polling, we have a lot of people from the US that have joined on the call today. So it's interesting because I'm an American, but I work for an organization originated out of Serbia. And to date, the bulk of the work I have done in the activism space with training and engaging others has been abroad. And it's interesting because I will tell you this. I've always carried, and I still do, the badge of all of the amazing nonviolent work that's happened in the US by way of change makers like Dr. King with a lot of pride. And people all over the world really continue to look at figures like Dr. King with inspiration on how they can wage their campaigns. And I noticed in the comments that someone mentioned, well, if US elections happen, it's important because it can impact others abroad, right? And I think that's very true. I'd love to have a call to action here to those in the US. I think that now is a time for us to start looking to others and learning from others. So we can acknowledge we've done incredible things in the past and there are amazing figures. We need to look to them too. But I would argue here in that pause, one of the first things that we should all be doing is looking at other countries that have recently experienced elections and backsliding in the way that we're seeing in the US and take lessons from those activists. What have they experienced? How has that backsliding really taken place? Where have they maybe fallen short, and where we can kind of take that lesson and pick it up? So that would be my key kind of thing. Take a pause and look to others and see what lessons you can learn and what inspiration you can draw.
I'm gonna plus 1,000 that. I think in the looking to others, there's like a history that's lost. And I say lost, but it's not lost. It's intentionally, obscured, where we think of key people as the figures of movements. And people are people. People are part of movements. Our movements are made up of people. And what is lost in that, like, obfuscation of history is like systems of care, is deep and intentional inroads to international solidarity and international analysis that has been, obscured. And I feel like when we're thinking about individual calls to action, there's a self-reflection that I feel like people can be doing, which is an assessment, a tool. We'll enter in the tool into the chat, right? What ways can we be doing and practicing a self-location in history? Like, who am I? Who are the people I come from? What ways does this show up? Who are my people? And when I say my people, who are my neighbors? Who are the folks that I organize with? Who are the people that I think of myself as in an electorate? What are my relationships to those people? Do I have relationship to those folks, these identities, etc.? How do we do and practice this self-reflection to take in the information and not just be looking to others, a elevated other, and think of myself as part of a movement? Because I wonder what is missing from people feeling activated and not disenfranchised from the information overload and the impact of larger decisions being made is how we all factor in and what power or influence we have. And not power as in a hoarding of power at the top, what ways we can practice and do some self-empowerment and collective and community empowerment, because our people have pushed institutions, shifted governments, movements, and it started with students, civilians, et cetera. And I'll throw that to y'all.
Thank you, Ashley. I would like to turn to you, Evan, because you've seen that aspect of, you know, what the things that have happened in Zimbabwe, and not only Zimbabwe, because I know that you've also been observing in other contexts. What are those? Ashley mentioned tools, assessment tools that help you kind of like analyze the moment, the historical moment, may be very, very useful in that sense. But what could be other tools or strategies that help kind of take advantage of that, post-electoral period, or even, big energy moment or big historical moments to build resilience and keep building on the efforts?
So one of the strategies that we used when we built the citizens movement in Zimbabwe over the period that we did was to always try and figure out what success or victory or progress meant to us as a movement. What does that look like, right? Because there are certain actions that we did, or certain campaigns that we did, or certain protests that we did, and we went in there with one mindset of what we thought the victory was, and when it didn't go that way, it really destroyed the morale and the passion and the drive. And I'll give you an example. So on the 6th of July 2016, we put together a protest, which was an unprecedented protest from a citizen perspective, which was to shut down the country. We actually called it Shut Down Zimbabwe. And this was in response to the government introducing a new currency that was going to destroy, Zimbabweans' savings. We knew it would destroy it because this had happened before. 2008, they introduced a currency. Actually, they introduced it around about 2006 and 7. And over a year and a half, that currency, ran at like 286 million% inflation. It was wild. We had like $100 million note. That was, sorry, not 100 million, $100 trillion note was the largest banknote that we had, like 1 and then 14 zeros. And everyone lost everything. So they were reintroducing a second one. And we said, no, we know we can't have this. And so we thought, let's draw everyone into one action where we all try and make them understand that we don't want this currency. So the idea was to shut the whole country down. And it was simple. Ask people to stay at home. I made a video. I said, I'm asking you to do something very simple. You won't get in trouble. You won't get in danger. Everybody can do this. Don't go to work. Don't go to the bank. Don't go to the supermarket. Don't go to school. Don't get on the street. Stay at home. And that protest worked beautifully. It was an amazing moment, right? 6th July came, the entire country comes to a standstill. But guess what? The government still introduced the currency. And there was a bit of a sense of, my gosh, that was such an amazing move. But look at this. They've just gone ahead because they just don't care. And that moment for us taught us that, wait, because we were suddenly walking our way with our heads low and we're like, we failed. We just didn't, we did that didn't work. But no, wait a minute. It did work. It worked for what our vision was when we started the movement, which was creating a space where more and more Zimbabweans can participate in the process of speaking truth to power. We had just achieved a monumental goal in the timeline of our movement, where we had got millions of people. We started off with just a handful in 2016, April of 2016. And by July of 2016, just a few months later, we had 9, 10 million people participating in the campaigns we were doing. Instead of that moment of them not changing, beating us down, our own framing of what our victory was to us in that moment lifted us up. And that gave us resilience. And part of what I kind of learned in this process is sometimes we kind of conflate resistance with resilience, right? Resilience is good, but resilience is really about thriving even in a time of failure or defeat or hardship, right? And this was our big challenge. How do we thrive? And so even out of that moment that could have been termed as being a failure, you didn't stop them from introducing the currency, because they did introduce the currency. Even out of that moment, what our victory was, no. We are actually taking this to the next level because we are bigger than we were before this moment. So it's important. So the strategy I'm trying, forgive me, I go around in circles. I'm one of those person who is on the ground, putting these things together. So I try to explain, I try to give you kind of an IKEA how-to manual with this, all the bolts and nuts that go with it. So for us, the strategy then became, as we went forward, and it worked so beautifully, was to frame our victory in a way that was divorced from the way that our opponent was framing the victory. We didn't allow them to frame the victory for us. We didn't allow them to frame what success meant to us. We framed it for ourselves. So whenever things happened and it didn't look like it succeeded, especially in the way that those we were protesting against framed it, we were always like, no, we have a way in which the way we were looking at this is that if we have more people, whether or not there is a change or not, if we have more people in the campaign, that's a success. We're taking the next step after that. And so we continue to grow. And even when we came from maximum security prison experiences, we found ways in which those experiences actually fueled our growth rather than set us back.
Thank you, Evan. Isabel, I saw you're self-muted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm so inspired by that example, Evan, for a couple of reasons. I think it's such a good approach to not only thinking about and strategizing for a movement, but also if we circle back to the resilience and the protection side. The reason I say that is because, maybe for those that aren't familiar, and please do correct me if I'm wrong here, Evan, but comparatively speaking, Zimbabwe is significantly more dangerous to do activism work compared to most of the US. I mean,
Yep.
we're talking kidnappings, murders, like it's incredibly violent and dangerous.
Oh, yes.
And what's so ingenious about that example, Evan, is that your movement was able to match the strategy of the action with something that was feasible by way of the protection and the resilience of the campaign, right? So it's not only the framing side, but you managed to achieve an action of civil disobedience while keeping the bulk of the participants safe. And that's incredibly powerful because that is a morale boost. That's a reason why people want to continue supporting your campaign and supporting your drive for change, because they see that you are being thorough and you are caring for them, unlike your opponent, right? So that is really the goal there. It's being able to match up some of this intentional thinking around protection to make sure the campaign is even more successful, right? Like you were able to achieve that because you thought about those protection angles. So I love the example, and I think that something really powerful for us to think about, because we know certain things are going to occur. We know emergency orders are going to be issued in the US. We know power is going to be consolidated and it's going to be abused. So we need to think about tactics that we can launch that will keep people safe while also achieving democratic change. And it is a series of small wins to achieve that victory, right? So it's just such a good example and something that us here in the US can really learn from Zimbabwe.
If I can just quickly respond so I don't forget before I hand it back to that, it's about, first of all, that's actually hadn't looked at it from that perspective, but it suddenly just gave birth to a thought in my mind, or at least a realization. that each time people in our movement experienced, they participated in a call to action and they were safe. There was a level of safety that they were comfortable. Each time that happened, when the next call of action happened, people were prepared to shift their comfort level, right? Even if it was slightly more dangerous than it was before or slightly more harder, they were prepared to just shift it just a little bit more based on that last experience of, hey, you know what? I mean, the last time we did this and it was amazing the way that worked. I want to see how this works. And it doesn't look that dangerous, just a little bit more. So there is that sense of the way you approach these things and the way you prepare for them just ensures that the people who are now with you are also growing with you incrementally, and they're committed even as you go into harder and harder and harder moments. I mean, we got to a point where a lot of what we were doing was online, and then we did that big, shutdown. But then when a group of us were arrested and we were being charged with treason, we saw spontaneously, without us actually calling, thousands of people showed up in person to the courts to demand our freedom. Arguably one of the most incredible moments that we ever saw in the building of this movement was how people graduated from one level of fear to the next level of courage, simply because of the way in which we were dealing with these very difficult and very hard moments, along the way.
You call that graduating because you created in real time a learning space for people, right? Like, we don't think of organizing as learning spaces. We don't think of organizing as training. We think of training as a other separate thing that should happen. But what the growing that was happening was a growing of trust, a building of relationships. It was organizing in real time, and you taught people how to show up for each other, how to organize against the system collaboratively. That was a learning arc, right? So we think about these things removed from each other, but like, if we are to be practicing resilience, and it is a practice, right? Like, this is a long marathon. We have to put the practice into the praxis. We can't microwave it. It means that we have to think about all these things as learning opportunities. We can't be rushing. That's how we learn from movements internationally. Like, we are in a resilience moment. We are in the community building moment. We're not just in a reactionary state. It can't just be term to term. It means that we have to be reflecting, and that reflection means, what else can we be learning? What else can we be doing? And how are we making connection part of that learning?
Wow. I'm just loving it. I'm taking, I'm just like, wait a minute, did she just break that? I feel like Zimbabwe and like, hey man, let's do this again, because I just learned something from Ashley.
Oh,
that
yeah.
I didn't realize what we were doing, but
Like, those are
You
training.
know, it's
too. They're
brilliant.
not. Yeah.
It's brilliant. And I'll tell you what, you even emphasized another thing, a pet peeve of mine, right? It breaks my heart when I see movements that are brand new in their development or don't have those kind of structures or plans in place and immediately turn to large scale street protests.
Correct.
No way. It's because if you think about it from a resilience and a strategic perspective of gaining those small wins, street protests, when they're massive, are a really powerful tool of political pressure. That's what we're doing, right? We want all of those people in the street to get the guy to resign because he thinks that everybody is against him, right? That can only happen as the very last step. You have to spend all this time gaining the support, win, 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 and then you launch those street protests. Why? Because you can apply that political pressure. And to Evan's example, again, in Zimbabwe, much more violent, the police are more likely to use live ammo in Zim on protesters than they would here.
And they have.
But they're less likely to do it if there's 500,000 people in the street. You can't shoot down
Exactly.
500,000 people. I know that's grim, but it's true. We have to think about it in these same kind of tactics, right? So the reason they were able to go, they had the momentum, they had the trust and the faith, and it also was in a hyper public space, right? So that again reduces the risk. of violence being used. So there is a way for us to combine these two and better guarantee that we achieve victory.
Mm, that's awesome.
1,000%,
Good
1,000%.
stuff. Are there any questions maybe from the audience?
Yes, we are going to go to the questions because I think we have been bombarded with like different questions, which, talk about the moment here. Let us begin with some questions in the Q&A. Emma Woods asked, she works as a well-known nonprofit and currently developing a democracy-focused speaker program. What topics and themes can be focused on that will be most beneficial for the general public and get them ready to fight for democracy without jeopardizing, the nonprofit status, especially now that we're seeing, the advancement on some threats around the civil society space within the United States. Some thoughts?
I can start some thoughts and then we'll see where it goes. I'm looking at the question. Without jeopardizing your nonprofit status, first I want to be like, I'm not a lawyer. Not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. And I think that you should be encouraging your team to focus on like narrative strategy. What are the ways that you can be having some of these conversations intentionally that aren't trimming the fat, that aren't falling privy to the swinging pendulum of like political ideology in this country, which, is a swinging pendulum, not for the material conditions of our communities, which continue to get more deeply impacted, more disparate. But I think thinking about how there should be a space just for people to think and strategize about what and how they want to be talking about democracy, what and how they want to be talking about justice, what and how these things intersect and what language they're going to be using. And I implore you, that strategy conversation should not be things that leave marginalized people on the cutting room floor. We have done that strategically. Our country and decision makers in our country in pursuit of democracy have done that strategically for years. And I say strategically as like a placeholder. I think that strategy yielded lots of unintentional consequences that have laid the foundation for where we are now. But I think a conversation about narrative strategy is important, a conversation about how we community build, connection build, because I think we'd be remiss if we didn't, and someone in the chat was talking about the impact of technology and like that is very new for where we are now. I think we would be remiss to think about these like co-epidemics impacts of like isolation, loneliness, rising of depression, and people being hyper online as ways, as like things that we need to be combating against. Because if we want to be learning from international solidarity efforts, we need to be having people feel connected to each other. And in the US, that is not the case. People do not practice connection. They do not have community. There's lots of deep isolation that we can't mobilize people sustainably and long term to do anything if they don't feel connected or if they are unwell.
Totally. Most of my comments really echo what Ashley said. I couldn't agree more. I'll say on the peace building and the community building angle, I feel that this is a big lesson out of Sudan. We really saw that the movement that achieved victory there during the transition, a lot of their work focused on making their changes, and they really struggled to engage the population that continued to support the deposed dictator. And we saw that isolationism, it just fed into the kind of divisions. And meanwhile, there were some guys in the military in the background that just swept up and took the whole thing. So peace building cannot be overemphasized and engaging the other side. It's meaningful to sit down with that family member that disagrees with you. That's powerful. Having those conversations, like those are small victories, right? The other thing I would argue from like the backsliding perspective, we're anticipating an increase in targeting towards nonprofit organizations out of the US. It's natural that this is going to happen, and especially with the administration we're seeing coming in. We can learn a lot from spaces like Serbia, where there are NGOs that continue to do really hyper transparent and positive work despite the continual backsliding. And what, we've really seen in the community is an effort to follow the law and to be hyper transparent. Because if you don't follow the law or you're not transparent, they'll pin you for it. They'll go after anything that you're in violation of. So do your very best to follow the law. And then secondly, start thinking immediately about information security. How are you containing the info within your organization so that, as Ashley pointed to, you're being careful about that narrative and you're able to control that kind of side of your transparency? The only other thing I want to add, and it's a little bit grim, but I want to make sure we're really sharing the information from you. In other contexts where we've seen this elections and then the immediate kind of backsliding, you'll find that the most immediate effect will come from law enforcement and the military when those emergency powers kind of come into effect. And activists tend to be the first groups that are targeted for repression. Increased surveillance, increased arrests, increased questioning. And what we've found in places like Iraq, Sudan, Egypt, and Myanmar is that the first groups of activists that are targeted in that backsliding are people of color and women. So I would really, really have that big call to action as a topic of discussion. When we think about that pause, we need to think about the risks to different types of activists, because some people will be targeted more than others. And those are the ones that we need to be focusing our protection on.
Thank you, Isabella. I am going to jump into the other two questions because they're related to this last point about protection and thinking. And hopefully we can also start exploring this more deeply, given, the need of the time. Christina asked, how can we help American activists see that self-assessment and resilience is not about the individual, but rather the collective? Because, there is the concern about the some of the meanings that the word self-care can take. And also there's also a big commercial meaning and also use of the word self-care. And that's not the type of, care that we're talking about. Evan, I saw you unmuted yourself. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a very important conversation to be had there around self-care, and I'm not sure what the perspective that the question may be asking about, but I want to speak to how do we look after the collective, and I think it's important to go back to the individual, right? When I look after the collective, we have to make sure that the individual also knows how to look after themselves. And there is no amount of health in our movement that can supersede the amount of health that is in the individual, that's in the movement, right? So, for example, I have to understand that, and Ashley and I were having this conversation just when we started at the beginning. We suddenly began to tear this thing apart. For example, I have to understand as an individual that even though I may have started the movement, it doesn't, number one, belong to me. And number two, the onus is not upon me to complete the goal of the movement on my own. It also does not take my health. It should not take my life for it to be credible or to be counted as something that was meaningful towards the movement. We revere the martyrs that we hear of, And I think part of what has happened with a lot of individuals who are in movements is that we want to make sure that we have left everything on the line for everyone to be convinced, for the collective to be convinced that we meant it, that we were brave, that we were courageous. And this is a mistake I made personally. And I'm trying to share this mistake I made personally because it's a mistake that affected our movement in many ways. The fact that I began to give in to the narrative of being courageous and brave in the face of anything and everything and at all costs meant that others in the movement, tried to do the same thing. And of course, it didn't go very well. It went quite poorly because when they did hit the wall, the result of that was that people completely left the movement after you have had an experience. You don't want to be part of it. The second thing that it did was that it made the bar for entry into leading or being part of the movement very high, because everyone thought if you're not doing what Ivan is doing, if you're not going to prison 8 times, if you're not being beaten, if you're not being, then you don't make the cut. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to sit back and let the brave ones do it. Right. So there has to be a sense of, in building our movement and the work that we're doing, a sense of, who am I doing it with? Who else do I want to hand this over to? Who has better ideas than me in this moment and in this season? Who can take this forward? This is not my time. I'm going to sit back. I'm going to play another role for this thing to be able to go forward. So there's a lot in there. I was sharing a couple of weeks ago, and I shared something that I kind of called the 7 unhealthy traits, of an activist. And just one of those is the mentality of not having an exit strategy or a torch passing on strategy. Who is going to come after you? Are you the be all and end all of the movement? Who else is coming? Who else is doing? Who else do you look at and say that is definitely the future, and it's better than what we did, and I love it, and it has to have space, and it must take on going from here. I stop there because I say a lot.
Thank you. Go ahead.
That's how I got in trouble. I talk a lot.
Listen, and words are really important because they're vehicles to people's minds. Okay. One, like, I appreciate and receive you practicing vulnerability, because whenever like people who are forefront facing practice that vulnerability, it gives everybody else permission to do so. And it is so important that people can speak honestly and transparently and not be worried about the weaponization of that vulnerability, that honesty, and that transparency about like missteps, about unintentional negative impact. I think that we've all inherited a legacy of a perception, a performance of one right way to resist that intellectually we know is not sustainable. And yet, when we're talking about sustainability, when we're talking about long-term change, world change, policy change, we think from the individual, and the individual like burning out turns into collective burnout, because when one person burns out, then everyone who is in that movement space, organizing space, organization, is then having to hold the person who is not willing to relinquish a work, is not practicing a care for themselves, and does not create an environment where care is important, care for each other, safety for each other, and is modeling then that sacrifice is the utmost currency, that we are going to sacrifice at any cost. And I think that at any cost is an important one, because if we're thinking strategically, this at any cost, sacrifice, duty, and honor cannot be at any cost, because the movement is a cost. Like, our people is a cost. Safety is a cost. Like, that is not a strategic decision. And then what ways can we show up and create and value care and sustainability in the same ways? It's going to require people to be like self-assessing and also vulnerable and also honest, and also people validating that there are different roles, different ways of participation, different methods of impact that are just as important and necessary for these resilient movements that we're going to have to build in the US as these things get, as Isabella said, really violent. But we also have a history of this. Like what I do, oh, don't want to be lost. Like we have a history of this internationally. People do practice care work. People do like use these systems and networks for these things, right? But that has been, it's relegated to, to the not shiny, not cute, not, not as important. So
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashley and Evan. And this element of collective care becomes more important, especially after you shared, Isabella, about like these concerns and things that we should be preparing for. The element of violence, and I do not want to like avoid this question, because violence is becoming, no, let me rephrase this, because violence has been part of the system. And also within the US, we've seen it, especially with African American communities and other marginalized communities. But we're seeing also a surge in certain types of political violence that comes from well-armed grassroots individuals and groups, says the question. What to do about it? How can, activists, organizers start thinking about that type of violence that has been historically within the US, fluctuating times, but we're seeing it also now, and the context might create or incentivize their resurgence or, an increase of them. So
I think this is an
Isabella.
incredible question and something to pose. I'm really glad that someone mentioned it. And, I'll just say that we see trends of this all over the world. It's quite normal in authoritarian countries for there to be militias or non kind of state groups that are associated with a political party and kind of carry out that covert action. And when I mentioned earlier that women and people of color, minority individuals tend to be the first targeted when that repression, it tends to come from those vigilante groups in order to provide that plausible deniability. It is happening in the US. There are armed militias in Michigan. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories around the US, but don't be clear, there are armed groups and they will start carrying out their activities. They already are in the digital space, and we'll probably see some more attempts, at least in the physical. Anywhere you are, any individual you are, there's some basic measures that you should take digitally, physically, and for your mental health in order to protect against anybody that could be wanting harm against you. So physically speaking, you should be varying your daily routines. Do not take the same routes to and from the same locations you go to. Do not create predictability in where you will be. This will help to avoid someone being able to track where you are and to approach you when you're in a more vulnerable position. Another one is to be conscious of the conversations you're having in public. Don't share information about where you're going, who you're with, all of these details around the campaign. Individuals might be listening into your conversations. From a digital perspective, make sure that you remove geotagging from anything you put on a social media. Be conscious of the pictures you're putting on. It might be able to display a pattern of behavior, right? If anyone can figure out your pattern or your routine, you're at risk of being targeted. And then finally, on the mental health side, really strongly recommend you identify 1 to 2 people that are not in the campaign or in your movement that can be a bit of a buddy that you can turn to if something happens, right? That can shield the campaign and other activists, and also make sure that you have a pillar that you can go to if you're in need, even if it's just having a chat or sharing some of the concerns that you might have. Those are some really basic measures we attached the link to our report in there. There's, of course, some more nuanced things to undertake for someone who's really public or the face of a movement, but I would say those are the kinds of basics.
Thank you, Isabella. I would add also that there are a lot of organizations that are also putting together curriculums and also like several resources. We're going to make sure that we also link them to the Democracy Resource Hub page that will be created after this webinar. So stay tuned. I'll like to go now to the question that was posed at the very beginning of the webinar, which is an interesting question about reactivity too. Here it is. And this is for any of you. How to ensure that any counter movement born after elections is not hijacked by the Trojan horses of the systems. And, thinking like Faisan also gives context, like initially any fuel is good fuel, but for longevity, the reactionary fuel isn't necessarily sustainable. So something that we're definitely thinking, especially given that, the importance that elections may have. Isabella, do you want to go?
Evan, you go first.
Well, what I was actually going to ask was, I wanted to just get clarity on that. I didn't really understand the question. So you said movements born, sorry, you said movements born after
Yeah,
an election?
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
Like usually there is, as elections can be exhausting for many movements, this is what I'm also interpreting. Like they can also be, a fuel. Like there can also be energizing moments. Depending on, like what the elections result might seem. So help to ensure that the movements that come after elections are not, reactionary, but and are not, hijacked or co-opted by, like system forces or,
Right.
anything else. So how to make sure that basically, I think it's more about how to take advantage of the energy coming out after the elections in a way that is sustainable, basically.
That's it's actually a good question, and and thank you for the viewer who asked it and for making it clearer, because it reminded me of something that we then learned towards the latter part of our movement, the point at which I was then beginning to hand certain things over to different people, and our movement began to take different forms. And two things come to mind. First of all, our movement is, in my mind, movements are not always going to be the exact same thing they were at the beginning, right? It's important to track the evolution of your movement. It starts off in one way. It's going to grow in different ways, and you can lead and guide it. But it's also important to kind of trace where it's going, because sometimes what it's becoming is also kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, is bespoke for what's happening. It's bespoke for the moment. So what worked at the beginning may not be working now, because there are different things happening. There are different people that have joined the movement with different ideas. And so it's okay for movements to take on different forms, right? As the journey progresses. But one of the biggest lessons that we found was that, yes, there were times that when we came to the end of a election process, either there were new movements that were coming, or the focus of who was speaking louder had shifted, had changed from us, those who were kind of calling people to protest, or who were onboarding people onto voter registrations. It had shifted onto something else. And I always give this, I spoke at the National Endowment for Democracy some time ago. And in the talk, I gave this example of the symbiotic relationship between particularly social movements and traditional civic organizations, in that though they are not the same, they are contributing to the same effort, but with different strengths. And it's important for us to recognize who has what strength and to keep each other inside each other's orbits, right? So you're not suddenly saying, hey, our part is done, we're handing it over completely, to something new or someone else. First of all, you don't own the struggle. I was reminded of this so many times, that you don't own it. It's not yours. You're a custodian. So there are moments where, a new expression comes in. We owe it to that expression to help nurture it, to help be a support for it, and to help it find its best, its best kind of, best expression. And this analogy comes from where I come from in Africa. It is the analogy of the rhinoceros and this bird called the oxpecker. And if you watch these things in the wild, there's always a little bird that sits on top of a buffalo or of a rhinoceros, right? And these two things, they're different in size, they're different in abilities, but they help each other. They survive together. The oxpecker picks the little ticks off the back of the ox or of the buffalo, and the buffalo is able to move around with this little thing on it. And for me, there's this sense of understanding that our movements and our work will undoubtedly become a landing pad for new things, for new ideas. Other people will see what we did, and they'll try and produce something similar or something that's inspired by it. We have to be okay with it, number one. And being okay with it is finding a way of how can we help you become what you need to become or what you're becoming. How can we take the learnings that we've had and the journey that we've had so far and allow you to be able to partake of that, so that you don't fall into what we fell into, so that you don't get wasted by what wasted our time and our resources, and you can move faster and you can do better. So that's the best answer that I can give for that. And I hope that works.
Thank you, Evan. Isabella?
Yeah, so Faizan, I read your question and I interpreted it a little bit differently. I'm not sure if you were pointing to any of this, but your question reminded me of some of the things we've seen in context where there's an election that also coincides with a movement's victory. And thereafter, you'll see a counter movement kind of develop out of the opposition. Yep, I knew this is what you were talking about. And a backlash to the victory or to the election. The most obvious example is Egypt, where we saw that the movement achieved revolution, and then the Muslim Brotherhood hopped on the bandwagon and then managed to kind of sweep it up and almost co-opt it. I'm not sure if you're pointing to Bangladesh right now, but there's definitely concerns around that happening in Bangladesh right now. It's a tricky answer. And the most straightforward thing I can say is that it comes down to strategizing and planning before victory or elections happen. If a movement is trying to make moves after victory and after elections have happened, you're already behind your opponent, right? We can guarantee that there's movements on the right in the US that are already organized and are all ready to take their actions. We should have been planning for this months ago, right? And that's the same kind of thing we would put down for the Bangladeshi student movement. It'd be wise to think about their relationship with the BNP before victory so that they're able to undertake what we refer to as horizontal and vertical negotiations, right? It comes down to continuing to engage them, create relationships, so that instead of there being a counter movement, you're actually all together and creating democratic plurality, right? You're coming together, you're debating ideas, you're talking about how you want your future to look as a singular country and not as individual kind of groups.
Thank you so much, Isabella. And I think we got to have two different answers that I think are actually very complementary, because thinking also about, maintaining the energy, but also like that element of cooptation that we had to be vigilant about. Just because we want to also have time to gather some thoughts, I did want to just bring the attention to the question that Jeff put on the Q&A, and that Ashley has so generously and graciously answer. But the question is also about, the first steps towards a graduated approach for movement building for democracy. And I think I'm gonna take a crack of this, but probably we can all do like a little round also of thoughts, apart from what you actually have shared, which is, the foundations of that, which is there is a big vibrant ecosystem. And thinking about ecosystem, I'm thinking about, like a beautiful garden jungle, like, alive in the pro-democracy civil society in the US. I think like the movements are there, and the efforts also to build that movement of movements are coming in different directions. And from my very humble external point of view, the coordination, the alignment, the weaving, it's happening. But we have to sustain it too with resilience. And I speak as someone that, inhabits some of these spaces, as an organizing fellow of Horizons, for instance. But also, like, I get to speak also to the amazing organizers that we have, like yourselves, Ashley, Isabella, and Evan. So that's just a bit of a complementary thing to add to that question, because the seeds are there, they're growing, they're giving some fruits, but also like the coordination elements of that ecosystem need to be more intentionally within, which I know a lot of you are already putting up that work. Evan, Isabella, would you like to add anything to that? And like also, and Ashley too, if you would like to also respond.
I'll add a couple of thoughts here. I think it's a really important question, and we can draw upon successful movements we've seen elsewhere in the world. I'd argue that the largest movements we've seen are not singular movements. Instead, it's better to think of them as a really big coalition of a bunch of other movements and a bunch of civil society organizations. I'd love everyone to shift their thinking in this so that we can, as activists, start thinking of ourselves as members engaging in politics in our country rather than witnesses of the politics, because that's what politics is: creating coalitions, negotiating over one shared vision, right? So first think of it as a large coalition, and the way that you go about that, I really agree with what Ashley is saying. The root analysis has to be aligned across that coalition, because that's how you create a shared vision of tomorrow. So everyone has to be aligned on the shared vision of tomorrow, which really comes down to right purpose and goals. And the other one I would argue is a stringent nonviolent discipline. You cannot have any kind of variety across the coalition in the discipline to nonviolence. We've seen issues with movements that have adopted semi-violent or unarmed kind of violent tactics where it actually can bog down parts of the coalition. So important for everyone to be on the same page. And then the last point is drawing upon Evan's comments around the last question. I think it's really important to acknowledge it's a coalition, but it's not one symbiotic built like being. It's okay for it to change and evolve, and you want that because that's how you're going to create democracy and kind of, in the US's case, I would say re-enrich it or reinvigorate it, right? So you want that diversity. It's a loose coalition and you're comfortable with it evolving and taking different approaches. But at the end of the day, everyone's committed to the same vision and everyone is nonviolent.
Thank you, Isabella. Evan?
I was going to let Ashley take a stab at this.
Okay.
I think that I would add to what Isabella anchored around, like, how are we, like, what's the shared analysis? I think there has to be an agreement on what, like, conflict rituals, what and how we're going to navigate around conflict as well. I see people in the chat talking about this, the euphemism of diversity of tactics. My facilitative brain thinks about how often in different spaces people are using language and assuming that they're using it the same way. And words are tricky things. They're just placeholders for value. But how often that gets lost when we talked about the practicality and the actions of movement, and then the ways that we like show up in rigidity around that. I think that be like also in those early stages of that loose coalition building, there's just some transparent conversations about like what and how we show up in relationship to conflict, what and how we show up in relationship to or commitment to ongoing or shared learning and building that shared analysis and committing to that shared analysis, particularly in relationship to conflict, is important because sometimes there's miscommunications that are happening, and also sometimes there are like we don't have the same understanding or analysis, and we don't actually have a shared vision. And what does it mean when there are people, entities, et cetera, that are you're supposed to be in coalition that don't have shared analysis, right? Like what then happens?
Well, I'm very cognizant of time. Just want to give you all like a little 1 to 2 minute final remarks before we close, and also give our attendees like a chance to share some final thoughts. Should I now give it to you, Evan, to bring us home?
Yeah. You know, it's the greatest lesson of of my my walk in um, fighting for the ideals of freedom and trying to help the people in our nation in Zimbabwe to live to live more dignified lives. The greatest lesson has been that we must always be present to participate, to do something about what is happening. As long as that something is driven by a desire to not only help ourselves but to help other people. And and over the last few years, I've been documenting this work that I got involved in, and early on, like I said, looking at what we did right when we thought we were wrong, and looking at what we did wrong when we thought we were right, and learning from those. And I've always kind of said this to people that courage is not defined by the amount of danger that we face, but it's defined by the kind of actions we decide to take. And 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 the definition for that courage for me is that courage is the decision to act for the things we care about the most. And whatever we decide to do or not do, the history of our nation will be told. The history of America will one day be told, with or without your voice, with or without your actions, with or without your approval. But whatever they will say about it, let them never be able to say that you did nothing. That's always been the way I have signed off, even in this part of my fight for freedom. Let them never be able to say that you did nothing. The success was in not that we changed it to what we wanted. It was in the fact that we showed up. The success in fighting Robert Mugabe at the time and Emerson Mnangagwa even now is not in the fact that we changed them, but that whilst they lived, whilst they perpetrated their injustice, they had to put up with the reality of our presence that was disapproving and that was trying to undo what they were doing.
Oh, Evan, Isabella, Ashley, you get to follow that final quick thoughts before we close the webinar.
This is Zoom double Dutch. What I will add on to all of the great conversation that's happening in the chat, and then also like sharing this and really important time with you all to talk through this. I think when we are thinking about resilience is a project. So many of these things are projects, and projects they should have plans, they should have clear roles, and it should not be done in isolation. How you determine what your role is, who you are working with in this project of resilience, who your pod is, and whether those roles are static is something. These are questions you should be consistently asking yourself. I think when I hold the weight of my own care, hold the weight of my individual impact, and in context, in historical context, in international context, I know that my contribution, my commitment has to be a commitment that is both like harm reductionist and has to be a commitment to continue to ask myself questions and continue to commit to learning. And that too is an act of resistance. That too is a care. And that too is making sure that I am deeply connected to, I'm like fighting the project of isolation, which is like a white supremacist project, right? Like I'm connected to history and connected to other people, not just connected to my own individualism and ideas, which I know was a question earlier. So ask questions, practice curiosity, and then make that part of your care plan.
Thank you, Ashley. Isabella.
Yeah, so I agree completely with Evan and Ashley's comments. And, what I'd like to emphasize is I think that something that really resonated in our conversation today is just around the different roles that go into a campaign and resisting. There's so many different ways that you can fight. And it doesn't have to be the like hyper public running out, like making all of this attention around yourself, because there's so many things that movements need to be successful and sustainable that involves so many skills that don't relate directly to what we think of as activism, like fundraising. We've talked a lot about training, networking, things like this. It's so important for a movement. So there's so many ways that you can get involved. And I think the only other thing is that as Americans, we need to remember that, our country is unique, our fight is unique, but there's people all over the world that have done incredible things in the space of nonviolent and activism. And there's so much that we can learn from them. Now is not a time for us to look inward and to just focus on what's going on here. In fact, we need to open up, right, to those that are against us, to our brothers and sisters abroad, so that we can come together and we can really pursue democracy together.
It has been mind-blowing and a privilege to be able to facilitate this conversation, to hear you all, to see the chat, to see our audience also so engaged. We will continue the conversation. Thank you so much to everyone. We will be, if you have a couple of minutes extra, we will be sharing a poll on some thoughts, key takeaways, any recommendations or feedbacks you may have. So please share it there. Otherwise, we will be sharing also the survey in the follow-up. Keep an eye on your emails because we will be sharing also the recording of this with resources, also including the resources that all of our audience was also sharing in the chat. I love also being able to just be present in this community. So much appreciation. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. In solidarity, we all stay in solidarity, and also with, that collective strength that is going to build that resilience and sustain us forward. Thank you so much.